Unplugged in, the American election and a projected president-elect.
I pledge to be a president who seeks not to divide, but unify. Who doesn't see red states and blue states, only sees the United States.
And American first, the vice president-elect is a woman of color.
But while I may be the first woman in this office, I will not be the last.
Votes are still being counted and some may be recounted as President Trump contests close elections in key states.
If you count the legal votes, I easily win. If you count the illegal votes, they can try to steal the election from us. If you count the votes that came in late, we're looking at them very strongly, but a lot of votes came in late.
The historic changes ahead to the balance of American political power. Next on Plugged In, U.S. 2020 decision. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, reporting from Washington, D.C. Former Vice President Joe Biden is projected to be the next president of the United States. The tipping point came more than 3 days after the polls closed in the U.S. In some states, the vote count was slow because of the massive number of mail-in ballots due to the coronavirus pandemic. Once Biden was projected to win Pennsylvania, he was thought to have won enough states to be elected president. Several states remain in doubt as local officials continue to count all the votes. President Donald Trump is moving ahead with legal challenges in several states where the vote count is close and mail-in ballots were heavily used. We begin with VOA senior White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara.
Jubilation on the streets in cities around the U.S. as Democratic nominee Joseph R. Biden secured a path to the presidency after news networks determined he had an insurmountable lead in the key battleground states of Pennsylvania and Nevada.
The people of this nation have spoken. They've delivered us a clear victory, a convincing victory, a victory for we the people.
Delivering remarks from his hometown in Wilmington, Delaware, Biden sought to heal a nation torn apart by months of bitter presidential campaign, urging his and President Donald Trump's supporters to give each other a chance.
Let this grim era of demonization in America begin to end here and now.
Biden promised to be a president for all Americans, laying out the work ahead for the country and his administration.
The battle to control the virus, the battle to build prosperity, the battle to secure your family's health care, the battle to achieve racial justice and root out systemic racism in this country, and the battle to save our planet by getting climate under control. The battle to restore decency, defend democracy, and give everybody in this country a fair shot.
With his wins in Pennsylvania and Nevada, Biden secured 279 electoral votes. As ballot counts continue in Georgia and Arizona, where Biden is leading, he may end up further adding to his total above the 270 vote threshold needed to win the presidency.
There's no question that the Biden campaign put together a broad coalition. They flipped several states that they had to flip in order to win this.
President Donald Trump left the White House to go golfing Saturday and otherwise did not make a public appearance, tweeting that he won the election by a lot. Even as Trump shows no indication of conceding, world leaders congratulated Biden as president-elect. The Trump campaign released a statement saying Biden is rushing to falsely pose as the winner, promising legal challenges to ensure the rightful winner is seated, a claim most experts say is unlikely to happen.
Even with some of the court edicts that could come down, it's just not enough to overturn anything that's happening with the election process right now.
As Biden supporters celebrate over the coming weeks, electors will formally cast their votes for the new president and vice president in mid-December. President Donald Trump remains in office until January 20th, when Biden is inaugurated with Kamala Harris as his vice president.
What a testament it is to Joe's character that he had the audacity to break one of the most substantial barriers that exists in our country and select a woman as his vice president. But while I may be the first woman in this office, I will not be the last.
Harris will make history as the first woman and person of color to ever hold the office of the U.S. Vice President. Patsy Vidakuswara, Daily News.
More than a week after the voting closed, most votes have been counted, but not all. In some states, the margins are still too close to project a winner. A recount of votes has already been ordered in the southern state of Georgia, where less than a half a percentage point separates President Trump from former Vice President Biden. And the Trump campaign plans to ask for a recount in the Midwestern state of Wisconsin, where the two candidates are separated by less than 1%. The margin is also slim in Arizona, where a Trump campaign lawsuit claims some voters on Election Day had their votes incorrectly rejected. In Pennsylvania, litigation is pending about the status of mail-in votes that were postmarked by Election Day but arrived up to 3 days late. The Trump campaign says the 3-day extension was granted illegally and is suing to get those votes thrown out. For the lawsuits to succeed, the number of votes in question must be large enough to impact the outcome of the election. While the race for president has been projected, the balance of power on Capitol Hill remains somewhat uncertain. Republicans picked up seats in the House of Representatives, but across the Hill in the U.S. Senate, Republicans hold a 50-48 lead, but there are 2 Senate seats undecided, both of them in the state of Georgia. They will be decided by a runoff election in January. For more on what to expect in the weeks and months ahead, I spoke to George Will, Pulitzer Prize-winning political columnist for The Washington Post.
First, we had the highest voter turnout in more than a century. Now, social scientists will argue that whether that is a sign of national health or national distress. I tend to think a high voter turnout indicates unhappiness more than contentment. I believe that Joe Biden will wind up with a higher percentage of the vote than George W. Bush got in 2004, defeating John Kerry. So the election indicated what we already knew, which was that the country's divided, passionate, and has decided that on balance, Donald Trump is just too exhausting.
He had about 72 million votes, which is about 10 million more than he got last time. And Vice President Biden, and we're still counting him, has about at least 76 or 77 million right now. Is that a mandate to Vice President Biden, or is the country closely divided that he really has to sort of temper some of the goals of the far left part of his party?
I think it's quite clear when you look at the Republicans holding the Senate so far. We shall wait and see what happens in the 2 runoffs on January 5th in Georgia. But the fact that the Republicans gained seats in the House, whereas the Democrats were quite confident they were going to increase their House majorities, that indicates that this is still a center-right country. And if you don't like that description, at least it's not a semi-socialist, progressive country hankering for a kind of democratic revolution. The country flinched from defund the police and other kinds of radicalism.
Let's assume that when the votes are officially counted and Vice President Biden becomes President Biden and President Trump is no longer our president, who is the head of the Republican Party?
That's an excellent question. There will be a mad scramble beginning almost immediately. In fact, it's already begun for the 2024 nomination, with the usual gaggle of senators who, as is famously said, every senator looks in the mirror in the morning applying her makeup or shaving, sees a president looking back. So they will be scrambling. But until then, Donald Trump will remain a tremendous presence in the Republican Party, if only because his astonishing use of social media, particularly tweeting, will make him such a force that Republicans everywhere will be looking over their shoulders, eager not to arouse I was going to say sleeping giant. I'm not sure he ever sleeps, since he's tweeting at 2 a.m. in some mornings. But he will remain, I think, a very important presence in Republican thinking.
You know, it's so interesting. People who I spoke to, a number of Republicans where I grew up in the middle part of the country in Wisconsin, said, I like what President Trump has done. I don't like his social media. I don't like the way he acts.
I think that's right, that if he had managed to subdue his behavior, as many people urged him to do, all unavailingly, I think he might have been reelected. I think it's very likely that he would have been easily reelected but for the pandemic, which cratered the economy, which was one of his big arguments, his economic strength, but also showed that he was simply incapable of showing the kind of empathy and steadiness that people wanted to see as deaths passed 200,000.
You mentioned coronavirus, which kept a lot of people indoors and at home and out of business the past 8 or 9 months, but it also kept Vice President Biden off the campaign trail, but it did keep President Trump off the campaign trail. Do you have a sense that that Vice President was sort of almost invisible on the campaign trails to the extent that President Trump was running against himself and that he lost this? It wasn't that Vice President won this?
I think the pandemic forced Mr. Biden into a prudent campaign. That is, there's an old saying in the armed services. I think it started with Napoleon: when your opponent is destroying himself, don't interfere. And I think the Biden people felt that the more people saw of Trump careening around the country, disregarding his own administration's public health protocols during the pandemic, in the closing weeks of the campaign, he was attacking LeBron James, the most popular athlete on the planet, and promising to fire the nation's leading infectious disease expert, Dr. Fauci. To put this politely, message discipline was not Donald Trump's strength.
You know, it'd be interesting to watch what's going to happen in the next 4 years. I don't think President Trump is going away. I don't know whether he'll run again. He would be about 78 years old, which is Vice President Biden's age now. But I don't think he's going to vanish from the political. I don't think he's going to ignore Vice President Biden and let him be president for 4 years. Do you?
No, I don't. Don Trump Jr. evidently has aspirations to be the 47th president of the United States. There's no shortage of senators and governors looking at this. And the one thing they will all agree on is that Donald Trump had his day and it's their turn.
When the rest of the world looks at our election this year, can we Americans so far, can we be proud that, that it may have been messy, but it was done well, or should we be embarrassed on how this has been handled?
It was messy this year, no question about it. But remember, the United States conducted a presidential election in the midst of the carnage of an extremely violent civil war. We conducted, between the 1860 and 1864 elections, we had off-year elections, no interruption whatever. This year, in the midst of a pandemic, with 50 different jurisdictions, 51 if you count the District of Columbia, with their own election procedures and laws, I think on balance, the United States gets a much higher than just passing grade.
George, thank you. Always nice to talk to you.
Glad to be with you.
For nearly half a century, former Vice President Joe Biden has been a prominent figure in Washington, D.C. political circles. He will need to draw on that experience to meet his next challenge of bringing together a divided nation in the midst of a pandemic and economic distress. VOA's Michael Sullivan looks at how former Vice President Biden got to this point of his political career.
The election came down to a few states, including the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, where the separation in the vote was razor thin. The sitting president and his supporters claim there were vote irregularities, which they say may reverse the current results. But after American news networks projected Democrat Joe Biden had an insurmountable lead, he declared victory and sought to bridge the country's political divisions.
For all those of you who voted for President Trump, I understand the disappointment tonight. I've lost a couple times myself, but now Let's give each other a chance.
During the election campaign, President Trump emphasized social unrest and law and order, while Biden criticized Trump for his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. President Trump trailed in the polls throughout. He mounted high-energy rallies in states such as Michigan and Wisconsin, where voters were seen as divided. For 8 years, Biden was Barack Obama's vice president and played a major role in his administration. In contrast to President Trump, a political newcomer when elected in 2016, Biden is an experienced politician, a fact he hammered home on the campaign trail.
I'm going to say something outrageous. I know how to make government work.
First elected to the Senate at age 29, Biden has held elected office for almost 50 years. Assuming current returns will be certified, at 78, he will be the oldest person sworn in as U.S. president.
He is bland, and the blandness normally would hurt him more than it does against Donald Trump. It actually gives people a very sharp, distinct choice.
Biden was chosen as the Democratic Party candidate after beating more liberal presidential contenders in primaries. One was the person who will be his vice president, Kamala Harris. With Biden doing little in-person campaigning because of coronavirus pandemic concerns, the campaign was ultimately about the sitting president. In a public appearance in the swing state of Pennsylvania, Biden spoke the day before the November 3rd election.
Tomorrow we can put an end to a presidency that has failed to protect the nation. Tomorrow we can put an end to a presidency that has fanned the flames of hate across this nation.
Also the day before the election, Trump expressed confidence in Wisconsin.
Remember what I said 4 years ago? I am your voice, and we will all together make America great again. That's what we're doing. That's what we've done.
Voters turned out in unprecedented numbers for a U.S. election, as high as 90% of eligible voters. The narrowness of the victory shows how divided the U.S. electorate is. Legal challenges mean that the election could ultimately be decided in court. The difficult task ahead, to unify a divided country. Mike O'Sullivan, VOA News, Los Angeles.
Former Vice President Biden is wasting little time following up on campaign promises. He announced a 13-member coronavirus task force led by former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy. Aides to Biden say in his first days in office, he plans to reverse President Trump's decision to withdraw from the World Health Organization, and he will seek to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal. Biden also plans to repeal a ban on almost all travelers to the United States from several Muslim-majority countries. He also plans to reinstate the program to allow children brought to the U.S. illegally to stay in the country without fear of deportation. A projected Biden-Harris administration marks a new milestone in American politics. Senator Kamala Harris is Black and of South Asian heritage. When all the votes are counted, and if she is elected vice president, when she takes the oath of office, this will be historic significance, adding a new chapter to American history. For more on the importance of this moment and historic voter turnout, I spoke to Peniel Joseph, a University of Texas professor and frequent commentator on issues of race and democracy in the United States.
So we saw a record turnout, and I think one of the reasons you saw that record turnout is that we increased the youth vote, we increased the Black vote, the Latinx vote. And when I say we, I mean America. We increased that vote just for democracy, right? So on some levels, you want as many people to vote as possible. And if Republicans or Democrats can get people of color voters to the polls based on their platforms or agendas, the better off our democracy is.
You know, it's sort of interesting looking at the map of the United States, and South Florida, which has a huge Cuban-American, Hispanic, or Latin population, that tends to be conservative, Republican, and that state, of course, just eked by for President Trump over former Vice President Biden. But that had a lot to do with where they came from, with Cuba, didn't it?
Yeah, and you know, when we think about Cuba, Cubans have always been more conservative, especially the Cuban community that has come out of the 1959 Cuban Revolution and sought asylum. So they've been obviously anti-Castro. They certainly are anti-socialism, as we define it by Fidel Castro, which is different from Scandinavian social democracy. So that community has always been much more conservative than what we think of as other parts of the Hispanic community.
It seems that a lot of the numbers, at least in terms of some of the Democrats, were disappointed because I think President Trump got one of the highest percentages of minority votes that any Republican has gotten since 1960. Not a huge number, I might add, but he got the highest percentage. Why would that be?
Well, I think it's a couple of reasons. I think one reason is that there's more ideological diversity among what we call the Black or African American community and what people are calling the Latinx or Hispanic community. Sometimes they get pigeonholed as just being predominantly liberal, predominantly progressive, and their views are just more complicated than just that label. The other, especially for Black men, and we saw this with certain rappers come out for President Trump, is that President Trump's hyper-masculine style, what some people would criticize as toxic masculinity, does have truck in certain parts of Black and Latinx communities where they like the macho posturing, and they voted for him in part because they found that entertaining.
We're still counting votes. States have not officially certified their elections, but there's a high expectation it will be President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, who obviously a woman, first Black woman to ascend to that, first woman to ascend to vice president. What does that mean? What does that mean to the world?
The fact that we have a woman of color whose parents were immigrants from Jamaica and from India is hugely, profoundly important. And I think it shows the best aspects of American democracy and what's possible when people struggle and organize to shatter these glass ceilings.
Well, it's interesting, this glass ceiling that's being broken in the United States now in the year 2020. Yet women have led countries all over the world. You've had prime ministers, Margaret Thatcher in England back in the 1980s. Angela Merkel's been there the entire life of many people who have lived to the age of 25 or 30. They've only known a woman ahead of their country. So it's interesting is that the U.S. has been a little bit late to the game on this one.
Absolutely. I think hopefully we don't do this with Kamala Harris, but too easily we've demonized women in a bipartisan fashion, whether it's Nikki Haley or Hillary Clinton. I think the political atmosphere we have here, we expect too much out of women in some kind of perfectionism, and their flaws are really highlighted. And I think we saw that with former First Lady and Senator Clinton when she ran, and Secretary of State Clinton. She ran as probably the most qualified person ever to run for president. And she lost, not the popular vote, but she did lose resoundingly in the Electoral College. And I think part of that had less to do with policies and more to do with how we don't necessarily give women a fair shake in our politics.
I do expect more women are going to step up and run for office. Is this start of a wave?
Yeah, we're already seeing it, both Democratic women and Republican women all across the country. We had record numbers of women just running for local, for state and federal office. And I think we should. Women are over 50% of the population in the United States. They're over 50% of the electorate, and they are not represented at the federal and the state and the local level based on their numbers. So I think having more women in politics is good because it reflects the diversity of our country.
Do you think that, assuming that it becomes President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, what's the impact? We know we have a good idea how we think it's going to impact the United States, but what about the rest of the world? Foreign policy, these continents are so important to us, whether it's Africa or Asia. I mean, the whole world. What does it mean to the world?
So I think people look to us as liberty's surest guardian. I think the interesting aspect of the world is that whether or not people criticize the United States, they look to the United States for leadership. And we can trace that back to World War II and the Greatest Generation. We can trace it back earlier, but certainly people look to us for leadership. And I think that people are very, very excited about the United States taking that proactive leadership role in the world again.
Thank you, sir. Nice to talk to you.
Nice to talk to you, Greta.
Once former Vice President Joe Biden was projected winner of the election, leaders from around the world offered congratulatory messages to the president-elect. The leaders of Brazil, China, and Russia have remained silent, citing multiple legal challenges by President Trump's campaign. VOA's Henry Ridgwell tells us more from London.
In Europe, perhaps the biggest celebrations were held in Ballina, Ireland, despite the coronavirus lockdown, the home of President-elect Joe Biden's great-great-great-grandfather.
It just hit us out of the blue, so it was exciting, but we're absolutely thrilled and just can't really put it into words, really.
Biden has often spoken of his pride in his Irish roots. He has warned Britain that its exit from the European Union must not jeopardise peace in Northern Ireland, and last year called British Prime Minister Boris Johnson a clone of Donald Trump. Boris Johnson said Sunday he was looking forward to working with the new administration.
I think there is far more that unites the government of this country and government in Washington any time, at any stage, than divides us.
The European Union also welcomed the election of Joe Biden.
Together, we will address pressing global challenges. The corona pandemic and its economic consequences, climate change and the loss of biodiversity, the necessary rule book for the digital economy and society, global security, and the reform of the rules-based multilateral system.
But Europe should not necessarily expect an easy ride, says analyst Inderjeet Palmer of City University London.
Given the increasingly competitive environment, I think the US will continue to drive hard bargains. The trade agreements with the EU and Britain will be not easy. And I think NATO, yes, I think they will demand the Europeans step up a lot more.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel appeared to acknowledge those challenges Monday.
Amerika ist und bleibt unser wichtigster Verbündeter.
America is and remains our most important ally, but it expects us, and rightly so, to make stronger efforts to take care of our security.
Europe hopes that Joe Biden will seek to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. Israel is vehemently opposed. In a video message congratulating Joe Biden, the Israeli Prime Minister did not mention the agreement.
I know him as a big friend of the State of Israel.
Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif wrote on Twitter, "Trump's gone in 70 days, but will remain here forever. Betting on outsiders to provide security is never a good gamble. We extend our hand to our neighbours for dialogue to resolve differences." China is in the midst of a trade war with Washington. Chinese state media said the election of Joe Biden offered more predictability. In Hong Kong, where pro-democracy protests continue against Beijing, some fear a softer approach from the United States.
I think at a time when totalitarian governance is rising in many countries, Biden's approach, though more peaceful or less forceful, is too gentlemanly.
Both Beijing and Moscow have yet to give official comment on Joe Biden's victory, noting that there are ongoing legal challenges to the result by incumbent Donald Trump. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
That's all the time we have for now. Thank you to my guest, Washington Post columnist George Will, and University of Texas professor Peniel Joseph. Stay up to date with our website, voanews.com, and follow me on Twitter @Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.